So the Lytle Award was established by the SSRL Users Organization Executive Committee to promote important technical or scientific accomplishments in synchrotron radiation-based science and to foster collaboration and efficient use of beam time among users and staff at SSRL. The awardee traditionally does not know that they've received this award until this announcement, and they don't usually present a talk on their research. However, with this being a virtual meeting, to ensure that we actually had the awardee present, we did make the announcement in advance. And this year's award goes to Kees van Genuchten. I apologize for garbling the pronunciation there, and I'm sure you'll correct me, for his research on technologies for removing toxic chemicals from water. I have a letter from SSRL Lytle about the award, and I'm going to read that letter out to you now. And he says, "Dear Kees, it is a pleasure for me to congratulate you as a recipient for the 2020 SSRL Lytle Award. I've read the descriptions of your successful research directed to the removal of arsenic from drinking water by electrocoagulation with iron. The novel and detailed understanding of the chemistry and structure of arsenic by capture in the iron structure of magnetite. Furthermore, this reaction is so complete that arsenic-contaminated water around the world can now be used without danger to the people. Your work is so important scientifically and scientifically inventive that it deserves much more recognition than the SSRL prize given in my name. Much of this work depended upon measurements at SSRL, where you brought your collaborators and students and taught them the techniques of X-ray spectroscopy. During my career, it was always a pleasure to bring others to SSRL and to turn the light on for them. There were a total of 35, some in groups and others as individuals, whom I had the pleasure to work with at SSRL. I would welcome the opportunity to meet you and discuss your work, and I wish you continued success. SSRL Lytle." So I think that's an excellent letter that describes perfectly the work that was done there. It shows how SSRL can have an impact on the world. And Kees, I'm going to let you tell the world when you're ready. So congratulations and thank you for giving your talk.
Let me see if I can share the screen now. And there. Okay. Wow, that was, I don't think I will ever receive another introduction quite like that. Yeah. Well, I guess before I get going, I just wanted to say very quickly how thrilled I was to sit in some of the workshops and the talks from earlier this week. I'm just blown away by the breadth of research that happens at SSRL and LCLS. I want to thank, SSRL Lytle, obviously, but the user committee, the users executive committee, SSRL and SLAC for this award. I'm very happy to be presenting some of the work that I've been doing at SSRL. And the title of my talk is How X-ray Absorption Spectroscopy Can Help Us Improve Access to Safe Drinking Water, with a particular focus on decentralized arsenic treatment in West Bengal. Okay, so I'd like to, before getting into any of the data, I want to acknowledge right off the bat two very important people, Professors Jaskill and Pena at UC Davis and Ashok Gadgil at UC Berkeley. So they were both my PhD supervisors. Jackie Pena is an excellent spectroscopist and geochemist, and she really taught me the ins and outs of doing synchrotron work. Ashok is an expert in technology design and sustainable development. They both had the kind of insight to understand the potential of synchrotron-based methods in water treatment. And so whatever light the Lytle Award shines on this work needs to shine on their work and their groups as well, because without them, I wouldn't be here. Well, I guess this is a nice slide, considering that introduction. It would be a big mistake not to acknowledge the pioneering of work of the person whose name this award goes on, SSRL Lytle. You can see him on the right. And this award has special significance to me because a lot of the data that you're going to see in this presentation actually collected with a Lytle detector. So Lytle detector is used for fluorescence measurements and X-ray absorption spectroscopy experiments. Okay, so this work has been, it's the sum of many, many people's efforts, but I want to call out 3 people in particular. So Shiva Bandaru on the left side of the slide, he's got a really interesting story. He's from a very small village in India called Nalabili. I first met him in 2014 when he was actually working with us doing the operation of some of these smaller scale prototypes that we had implemented in India. Then he applied and started a PhD at Berkeley and actually finished this summer. So Shiva, if you're out there in cyberspace, congratulations. The next person is Abhishek Roy. So he was a PhD student at Geological University in India, and he also graduated this year. And just as a note, researchers at Geological University have been a really strong collaborator with us throughout the many stages of this project. And finally, Simon Muller, who was a master's student working with us. You can see him on the right. He also finished recently and started a PhD at Delft University of Technology. Okay, so going straight into arsenic. What I'm showing here is a global map of the probability of naturally occurring arsenic in groundwater above 10 micrograms per liter. And that's the World Health Organization standard for arsenic in drinking water. So this is from a very recent science paper, and this paper estimates that about 100 to 200 million people are potentially exposed to arsenic levels above 10 micrograms per liter, but the vast majority are located in rural, decentralized communities of Bangladesh and Northeast India. And these are communities that are cut off from traditional infrastructure that you would expect that would you could use for conventional water treatment, right? So there's no piped water supply there. Now, chronic exposure to arsenic in drinking water leads to a variety of health impacts, including painful skin lesions on your palms and the bottom of your feet, but ultimately to cancer and death. Now, because of the severity of arsenic poisoning in this part of the world, it's been called the largest mass poisoning in human history. So the problem of arsenic in this part of the world, in these decentralized communities of South Asia, it's been going on for decades. And despite the amount of research that goes into technology design, so the design of arsenic remediation strategies, there hasn't been a whole lot of progress in seeing sustained impact of these methods. So that's kind of what I'm showing here on this slide. This is the all too often fate of technologies that have been implemented, and they kind of just fall into disuse. And there's a lot of reasons why that happens, but I think the most important one is that these technologies are not designed with the behaviors and the socioeconomic characteristics of the end users in mind, right? So for a technology to be sustainably operated in communities like this, it has to fulfill a variety of design constraints that you might not normally think about. So obviously the technology needs to be able to remove arsenic to below relevant drinking water limits. It needs to be extremely cheap, needs to be easy to operate and maintain, produce little waste. It would be great if it was easily scalable. But I think, at least from my perspective, one of the most important things is that everything that goes into the technology, all of the components of the technology need to be locally available and locally affordable, because that cuts down on supply chain. And I think supply chain, a complex supply chain is a major barrier to sustained operation in rural areas. So the technology that we are developing is based on iron electrolysis. In the literature, it's called iron electrocoagulation, or iron EC, and we believe it has a number of properties that lend itself to these kind of resource scarce and constraints that you would have in rural areas, right? So the way that this technology works is we use existing groundwater wells and we pump the groundwater into large tanks. Then we take pieces of steel or iron. So iron is non-toxic, it's ubiquitous, it's very easy to find even in kind of remote communities. We take pieces of steel, put them into the tanks with the pumped groundwater. Then we attach electrically the pieces of steel to a low wattage power supply. So that could be a car battery, a PV cell, etc. So that electrical connection passes current through the system to oxidize the iron or steel to produce iron 2. Iron 2 is then oxidized by dissolved oxygen to produce particulate iron oxides. So arsenic forms a bond on these particulate iron oxides, and so to remove the arsenic, you simply remove the iron oxide, and you can do that by gravitational settling or filtration. So what I'm showing here is just a little image, but you can see this is an image from the lab. You can see that the system, you can generate rust very easily, and you get this reddish or brownish color, right? Now, on paper, this technology is relatively simple, but the chemical reactions that happen during treatment are quite complex, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. But what I want to point out here really quickly is one kind of technical property of the system that's pretty interesting. It's that the applied current is directly proportional to the rate of iron production. So simply by changing the way that we apply the current, we can change the way that we input iron 2 into the system. So I'll come back to that later on. Okay, so I included this slide just to kind of give you an idea for how we've kind of built up the prototypes over the years and the kind of time scale that this takes. So typically in the lab, we work at relatively small scales, these 200 milliliter beakers. And then we've built that progressively up, and up. And now the largest plant that we have is a 10,000 liter per day capacity plant, which we built in India, or was built in India, and is implemented at a school in India. And we target schools to implement this kind of technology, and for some socioeconomic reasons that I can address after the presentation if there's questions. But right now, this 10,000 liter per day capacity plant is housed at a school in a rural area in West Bengal, and that's what the map in the upper left corner shows. So this school is, it's close to Kolkata, but it's in a really, it's a decentralized area. It's close to Bangladesh as well, but still in West Bengal, and you can kind of see what the school looks like in the upper right-hand corner, kind of a bird's eye view of what it looks like. Now on the bottom sides, or the bottom images of this slide, you can see the light blue exterior of the school, and actually Shiva and I are in the bottom left-hand corner, right over here. But I want to draw your attention to this dark blue building, this dark blue structure next to the school, because this is actually where the plant is housed, so directly adjacent to the school. Now, if you go inside that dark blue building, you'll see the 2 electrolysis tanks, right? And if you look down inside the electrolysis tanks, you'll find the pieces of steel. And in this case, that image shows that the water is kind of brown, and that's the iron oxides. So there's Shiva and I doing some electrochemical measurements, but this water is then fed into a settling tank, which separates the iron oxides from the treated water. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on the project. What I'm showing here is a little cartoon of the key stages of treatment, right? So we have the electrolysis tank, where iron 2 is added electrochemically with the source of iron as these pieces of steel. That's fed into a coagulation tank, where iron 2 is oxidized and iron 3 precipitates form in the presence of arsenic. And then that's fed into a settling tank, where the arsenic-rich iron oxides are separated from the treated water. So it would be impossible to describe all of the knowledge that we've gained from SSRL experiments. But I want to try to focus on 3 quick ones before getting to the more recent experiments. Starting with the electrolysis tank, after months and months of repeated operation and tests in the lab and in the field, what we found is that on the surfaces of the steel, we actually accumulated some oxidized iron metal, right? So we formed this really interesting surface layer. And what Shiva and Simon did as part of their thesis is they collected iron K-edge EXAF spectra to try to understand, well, to characterize what the surface layer was, to determine what it was made out of and how it formed. And then they used that information to develop methods of minimizing the growth of the surface layer, because we found that this surface layer actually decreased the efficiency of the system. So moving on to the coagulation tank. Actually, this is probably where we've spent the most time and effort looking at the chemical reactions that underpin the technology. So I have a little reaction schematic here, but the chemical reactions that happen during treatment can actually be quite complicated. And we used arsenic KH Zanes and EXAF spectra and iron KH EXAF spectra to kind of unravel some of these complex reaction pathways, which include arsenic 3 and iron 2 co-oxidation. And we also determined the structure of the iron 3 precipitate and how exactly arsenic binds to the solid phase. And so the outcome of all of that spectral analysis was the ability to create very detailed models of the structure and reactivity of the solids that form as a function of pH and a variety of common groundwater ions like silicate, phosphate, calcium, and magnesium. And so in this last stage of treatment, what we were really after is trying to figure out a way of disposing of the sludge on a long-term basis. And so what Abhishek did as part of his thesis is he looked at stabilizing the sludge in concrete, basically mixing it in concrete. And so we used iron and arsenic KH EXAF spectra to track the transformation of the arsenic-laden iron oxides as it's mixed in concrete. And what we found is that the iron oxide particle actually transformed completely into an iron siliceous hydrogarnet phase. Arsenic became released from the iron oxide and formed its own calcium arsenate, distinct calcium arsenate phase. And with that information, we actually used that to explain why, even under aggressive leaching conditions, arsenic was not leached from this concrete mixture. So combining all of this knowledge gives us a very detailed understanding of the key reactions that happen at each stage of treatment, right? And that helps us to select the most effective operating parameters and lets us make very accurate predictions of the performance of the system under a variety of different conditions, and ultimately helped us generate this next plot. So what I'm showing here is the long-term arsenic removal performance of this 10,000 liter per day plant. As you can see, over extended months and months of operation, we were able to decrease the arsenic level from 240 micrograms per liter in the raw water to below 10 micrograms per liter, and often below 5 micrograms per liter. And that was over months and months of operation. So with this kind of reliable and sustained performance, we moved on to the next step, which was actually distributing water to the children at the school. So this was a really satisfying and wonderful day, and I was actually at the plant the day that we first distributed water to the school children. In the upper left-hand corner is an image of, because the distribution of water to the school children generated a lot of attention, some local politicians came to kind of see what was going on, and that's an image in the upper left-hand corner of that. Now, at this point, we had actually handed off operation of the plant to a local company, and so the local company took charge of distributing the water to the kids. But every school child had a electric kind of key card, where they could interact with the water distribution kiosk, and you can kind of see that in the bottom images. So every child could put their key card against the water distribution kiosk, and 1 liter of water per child per day would come out. So if the plant is working well, what's next? So I'm going to answer that by starting with this plot. What I'm showing here is the arsenic drinking water limit, depending on what country or state you're in. And I kind of highlighted 1,000 micrograms per liter because that's the highest range of naturally occurring arsenic that you would find in the environment. If you bring that down to 50 micrograms per liter, that's the drinking water limit in Bangladesh. Bring that down to 10 micrograms per liter, that's kind of this, again, the global arsenic drinking water limit that's adopted by the World Health Organization and a number of other countries. However, there's a lot of recent evidence that suggests that chronic exposure to arsenic levels, even below 10 micrograms per liter, leads to unacceptable health risks. So that can be diabetes, cancer, etc. So that's prompted, very recently, some regulatory agencies around the world to decrease the permissible arsenic limit in drinking water. And I highlighted here New Hampshire because that just happened. They reduced it from 10 micrograms per liter to 5, and that's also the limit in New Jersey and Denmark. But in the Netherlands, they've actually reduced it to 1 microgram per liter. So all of this is suggesting that technologies that can achieve ultra low levels of arsenic in drinking water are increasingly important. So now I showed this image earlier on in the presentation. What I want to point out again here is that by controlling the way that we apply the current, means that we have some control on redox reactions involving iron. So keeping in mind that that low 1 microgram per liter arsenic level is important, what we can actually do is tune the system to produce different types of iron oxides simply by changing the way that we apply the current. So these different iron oxides have different amounts of structural iron 2. So green rust has 66% iron 2, magnetite has 33% iron 2, and your standard iron 3 oxides do not have any iron 2. But again, these are solids that are produced with the exact same system. So what we did is we applied iron KH EXAF spectroscopy to kind of determine the formation conditions of these different types of iron oxides, in an effort to exploit the kind of flexibility of the system to produce different types of iron oxides to generate the most effective one for arsenic uptake. So that's what I'm going to summarize here in this plot. So what I'm showing on the y-axis is the residual arsenic concentration after filtering the particles of either green rust, iron 3 oxides, or magnetite. That's on the y-axis on a log scale. On the x-axis is the initial arsenic concentration. And the two horizontal gray lines are the World Health Organization limit and this 1 microgram per liter target. Okay, so how did these iron oxides perform? Well, I should start by saying generally all of the iron oxides were pretty effective at removing arsenic. So over 95% arsenic removal for each type. But magnetite performed exceptionally. So it didn't matter what the initial arsenic concentration was. It didn't matter what the pH was. It didn't matter if it was initially arsenic 5 or arsenic 3, even though I'm not showing arsenic 3 data here. Magnetite was able to decrease the arsenic level to below 1 microgram per liter every single time. And that wasn't true for the other iron oxides. So to try to understand why that was, we applied arsenic KH EXAF spectroscopy. And so what I'm showing here is the arsenic EXAF spectra for arsenic taken up by green rust and iron 3 oxides. And you can see that it's a relatively smooth oscillation, right? But that's not true for magnetite. So magnetite, arsenic taken up by magnetite in the system, the EXAF spectra had these really unique beat features, right? You could see that highlighted by the asterisks. If you Fourier transform this, perhaps it's a little bit easier to see. Those different beat features manifest, particularly in the second shell, which is due to arsenic iron pairs, as a much larger amplitude, right? And a little bit of a shift in interatomic distance. And so when we modeled that, when we did shell by shell fits of these data, what we found is that for green rust and for iron 3 oxides, arsenic binds to the surface in this kind of binuclear corner-sharing 2C geometry, and that's based on the fitted interatomic distance and a coordination number of around 2. But when we do this for magnetite, first off, not only can we fit 2 arsenic iron pads in that second shell peak, but the number of iron atoms that surround arsenic are significantly higher, right? So the coordination number for the first atomic pair was around 7, and the coordination number for that second arsenic iron atomic pair was 5. And so if you look at the crystal structure of magnetite and you compare, and magnetite is actually one of the only iron oxides that has tetrahedral iron, which is the same shape as arsenic 5 and arsenic 3, these fitting results suggest that arsenic is taking up a tetrahedral site in the magnetite particle and actually becoming partially incorporated, right? So a different kind of arsenic uptake mode. Now, that different kind of arsenic uptake mode is likely leads to a different thermodynamic equilibrium between arsenic in solution and arsenic bound to the solid phase, and that can help explain why we see that magnetite is so much more effective than the other iron oxides at decreasing arsenic to below 1 microgram per liter. But it's not just that magnetite is better at removing arsenic from solution, it also hangs on to it a little bit more. And so what I'm showing here is the fraction of arsenic released from magnetite and iron 3 oxides by extractants, sodium hydroxide and phosphate. And so clearly arsenic is less likely to be remobilized from the particle if magnetite is generated. So we're coming up towards the end of the presentation, and I kind of want to leave you with a controversial maybe or non-intuitive question. So we saw that magnetite is more effective at removing arsenic from solution. It's also more effective at hanging on to arsenic in the presence of different extractants. But is that what we actually want? Do we want to design a system where arsenic is bound strongly? And the reason why I ask that is because one of the major unsolved challenges of arsenic treatment is that concentrated arsenic-laden waste is generated regardless of the technology. Membrane techniques, reverse osmosis, iron-based technologies all generate arsenic-rich waste. And there's not a real sustainable way of managing this material yet. So I mentioned before that we've done some experiments putting sludge in concrete for use in local construction, like roadways or so, but I think we can do a better job. So what I want to try to do is change the way that we think about the sludge as something that needs to be disposed of, and think of it more along the lines of a resource where we can actually use it to maybe, I don't know, sell it to make some funds to offset the costs of treatment. So that's kind of my dream, is to develop some chemical, electrochemical, microbiological methods of removing arsenic from the solid phase, and then using those pools of arsenic and iron to create some products that have industrial use, right? And you can imagine that magnetite is much less likely to remove arsenic. And so maybe magnetite might not be the best iron oxide in the context of the entire treatment, right? If we're thinking about the circular economy of this kind of waste. So while we have some good ideas, we don't know exactly what these products are going to be. But what I do know is that SSRL will be a great resource to study the chemical bonding of iron and arsenic throughout all of these stages of the circular economy. So what I'm hoping for is another decade or 2 or 3 of continued work at SSRL. With that, we've come to the end of the talk. I'd like to quickly acknowledge all of the help over the years from staff at SSRL, the Users Executive Committee, Ryan Davis, Eric Nelson, Matthew Latimer, Sharon Bone, Kathy Knotts. I'd also like to acknowledge the other synchrotrons where some data was collected, so the APS and ESRF, and of course the funding agencies, the Dutch Organization for Scientific Research, and the US NSF. And with that, thank you for attending, and if there's time for questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Well, thank you very much for that talk. We do have time for a few questions, and I have one question from Alfred Zong. And his question is, assuming the cost and logistics are not an issue, would other transition metal oxides outperform iron in terms of arsenic removal?
Yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting question because I think the short answer is it could be. There could be other types of adsorbents where you can remove more arsenic per mass of the adsorbent. The challenge is that how do we get these kinds of more complicated adsorbents into communities that are cut off from resources and infrastructure? So if the question is logistics and costs are not an issue, I would say that it is likely that we can create an adsorbent that has a little bit more complexity, but would be able to achieve some of the kind of arsenic removal efficiency that we see with electrochemically generated magnetite.
And second question, could this approach be used in general for other kind of contamination with mining sites or radioactive issues and things like that?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I often say to people who ask about the kind of applicability of a system like this is that it depends a lot on what the end use is and who the end users are. So I'm kind of hesitant to always say, yeah, we can kind of copy and paste this approach in different communities in India, because it depends a lot on building trust within the community. It depends a lot on what the actual initial arsenic concentrations are, the groundwater chemistry. But if you're thinking about mining waste, I think this would be an excellent way of kind of scaling back certain, not all heavy metals, but certainly some of them. And one kind of interesting thing about this technology that I didn't mention, there's plenty that I can talk about, but in terms of, so oftentimes with acid mine drainage, you have pretty low pH. I didn't talk about the reactions that happen on the cathode. So on the anode, you're oxidizing iron 0 to produce iron 2. On the cathode, you're actually reducing water to produce hydrogen. And so you're consuming protons there. And that increases pH. So this technology would not only be good to generate reactive iron oxides to pull out some of those metals from solution, but also to get pH more towards circumneutral levels.
Cool. And you mentioned another comment that you'd like 10 or 20 years more beam time to continue this. It looks like you've had great success with SSRL. Is there something unusual that makes this your source of preferred source?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm still actually kind of trying to figure out why the data I've collected so all of the arsenic data I showed was from beamline 4.1. I have tried to collect similar so arsenic data at similar beamlines at the ESRF, and the data quality is never as good. And it's probably a mixture of the detectors we use, some of the properties of the actual X-ray beam, but I think in my experience, beamline 4.1 and 11.2 with that really fancy germanium detector, the signal to noise ratio is always much better at SSRL.
Oh, that's fantastic to say at the SSRL users meetings. Well, thank you. I think that's the, I'm just looking at my comments here as they come up. I think that is the last question that I can see here. I do have a comment that someone said great staff and support. That's right. As well.
Yeah, that's my old PhD supervisor, and I would say that she's absolutely right. Excellent staff, fantastic support. It's just the best. It's the best synchrotron in the world. I'm sure we would all agree.
Great. Well, thank you and congratulations again. We give you a nice certificate and shake hands and do all that wonderful stuff, but that's going to be for another year, I think. I think there is one other question that's in the chat, but I'll ask you if you could answer that to the person that questioned it. Sure. And I'm going to hand over now to Emma for the next part of this session. So thank you, Emma.